I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Cort as our next speaker today. Andrew has been a member of the CFPSS for the past couple of years, and it's been a joy and a pleasure to get to know him in that time. From an early age, Andrew has had a number of numinous experiences, which intensified through his late 40s and his early 50s, and so much so that he took early retirement from the world of engineering and business to become a spiritual healer and to further his knowledge through studying for a master's degree in Contemporary Theology at St Andrew's University. Andrew, we are so pleased you're here to speak to us today. Welcome.
Welcome to you all this afternoon. Share my screen. 30 minutes. Right. Hopefully everybody should see the first slide of my presentation. And I just want to say thank you for having me. It's an honour to be speaking to the members of the fellowship. I actually first thought about joining the fellowship for numerous reasons back in the 1970s, a long time ago, but didn't at that time because I didn't feel I was been around long enough in life to really make much of a contribution or actually fully participate. Now, I have the honour of, I'm retired now, what I used to call the graveyard shift, which is the presentation straight after lunch, when maybe everybody's, slightly sleepy after a good lunch or whatever, having breaks and so on. So just as I go through this, I'm going to pose some questions to you all. And I don't want any response now, but these are just questions for you to ponder on and think about as we go forward. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about myself and my background. I'm an applied scientist and engineer from background and training and interest. Born in Bolton in Lancashire, a long time ago. More than I care to mention, I was educated at the Church of England primary school. I went to a Methodist boarding school, which we nicknamed Colditz. I'm sure it would make Sammy smile after his comments about Methodists earlier on, but it's fine. Founded by John Wesley on the hills above Bath and Somerset, as it was at the time, and it was nicknamed Colditz because the Colditz show was on the television at the same time, and it was extraordinarily cold and Gothic-like in style. I trained as a naval architect and shipbuilder. I spent 10 years in that industry after coming to Scotland 40 years ago, and then moved over into the oil and gas business. Actually, the photograph of the frigate in the top left-hand corner is HMS Cornwall, one of the very last ships that I worked on. And the picture below, which looks a bit strange, is a subsea oil and gas field, maybe a little bit topical at the minute given what's taking place in Eastern Europe. And the company I worked for 28 years designed, built and supplied this equipment. As I said at the start of this, applied scientist and engineer by training. And my habit, my natural way of thinking is boiling things down to their fundamentals and their absolutes, wherever possible, in order to gain an understanding what's taking place and taking naval architecture in its basic forms. Ships either float or they sink, they either float upright or they capsize. And also you design the hull strong enough to make it as light as possible for the energy consumption, but strong enough to take all the seaway, etc., that's going to be exposed to. I was brought up as a high Anglican, went to a lovely church. The village next to our home was in the West Pennines, a place called Chapeltown in Turton, St Anne's School. And the primary school I went to was a Victorian, built in 1873 primary school at the side of the church. I had my first extraordinary experience at 7. We'll touch back to that later. That particular experience has haunted me all my life in a very, very positive way, I mean to say. As I said, these experiences have continued throughout my life and what's taken place. And right now, I'm currently studying for a master's degree in Contemporary Theology at St Andrews. The beauty of living where I live, I'm in West Fife, just north of Edinburgh, and St Andrews is only 40 miles away, just a little over an hour's drive away to get to. And it's a beautiful place. I describe myself as an unorthodox Christian, and I should think you'll get an element of that as we go through this discussion. Before we get into this, and it's interesting, one of my areas of interest are the mystics and mysticism, and a number of people when they hear about this saying, can you actually define what a mystic is? Can you actually define what mysticism is? And led me that I think that we need to actually just have a quick look at definitions and understand what these come from. I've taken these two from a combination of the Oxford and Cambridge dictionaries. Mystic, one who seeks by contemplation and self-surrender to obtain union and absorption with God. Quite funny, actually, when I was looking at some of the inline dictionaries, one of them actually turned around and said the mystic is too complicated to actually define, which I thought was hilarious and interesting for an online dictionary. Whereas mysticism is the belief that there is a hidden meaning in the life of each human being and they can unite with God. So that's the basis with which I'm bringing various elements of this talk together. One of my passions is astronomy, hence I've used some beautiful photographs from deep sky telescopes shown in this presentation. So in outline, I want to talk about Evelyn Underhill, arguably one of the leading famous Anglo-Catholic mystics and spiritual directors of the 20th century. A summary and review of her life, certainly her early life, which I find most interesting. I want to talk about the coupling of opposites. We were having a chat on our WhatsApp discussion earlier on. This came up a few weeks ago, and I think it's important as we get further into this. And again, this is the analyst getting down to the fundamentals to understand what it is that we're looking at by looking at its natural opposite, which in form makes the whole. I want to talk about awakening, the illumination and ecstasy, the dark night of the soul, traveling through the dark night, some closing thoughts throughout this presentation, and then we'll have some questions at the end of it. The sections here on awakening, illumination, ecstasy, and dark night of the soul are actually some of the key sections in Evelyn Underhill's famous work, Mysticism, which was published in 1911. Here we have Evelyn. She was born in 1875 in Wolverhampton, an only child, and died unfortunately in 1941 during the Second World War. The photograph at the top is when she was 15, and the one in the bottom left-hand corner is her in later life. Home educated. She had a series of mystical experiences from a young age, and we'll explore those a little bit further later on, but she had this sense of God and this sense of other from a very early age. Went to boarding school. I think it was down somewhere in the home counties, and it was a mediocre boarding school, but basically home educated. She had access to her father's library. He was quite a famous barrister in his time and made great use of the library that he had. She was initially agnostic, but experienced the presence of God and was increasingly aware of two worlds. This idea of dualism, two worlds overlaid with each other, coexisting together. And she became theocentric. That is, she believed in God, but not in the Christian philosophy. She would turn to the Christian philosophy later on in life. She actually considered the Christian church early on in her career as being something childish and superstitious, and she actually used that word in some of her own writings. She, because of her experience, and this is something that was quite interesting and common, we probably frown upon it now, she joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn from 1903 to 1906. And this was exploring some of the esoteric thoughts, astral projection, out-of-body experience, greater reality through a form of ritual and reading and so on. And she was there for 3 years, as she explained. I guess this would be like us as youngsters today playing with the Ouija board when we were younger, thinking outside the box, maybe even playing with tarot cards, which is an interesting aspect because she had some very firm friends connected with her over this period. One was Arthur Conan Doyle, another was Charles Williams, and also A.E. Waite, who actually was a famous Christian writer of his time, but he also was responsible for the creation of the modern tarot deck that we see today. She got married in 1907. She had had some time traveling through Italy. She fell in love with Italian sacred architecture in Umbria and Tuscany. And she actually thought about joining the Catholic Church at this period. However, her husband, who was also a barrister, an Anglican, pardon me, did not want to do it because he was concerned about the confessional, so she actually did not. She published 3 novels. This is my particular area of interest. They are very interesting reading, and I argue that they reflect, in a semi-autobiographical basis, elements of her early life. She published a major treatise in 1911 when she was 36 years old. And actually, she did a majority of her really strong work in these early years. This is the reason why I'm so interested about this first year of the 19th century in her life, because there was so much going on. She had a series of spiritual directors, but the one who made the greatest impact was a chap called Baron Frederick von Hugel, who wrote, he too had many mystical experiences, and he wrote a treatise on work on basically mysticism in the major religions, and that was published in 1908. And he was a major influence on Evelyn, and in fact, she was extraordinarily fond and close to him, and actually he became a major influence in her life, to the extent that she actually only became a public commitment to becoming an Anglican in 1921. This is interesting for me because she's considered as a great Anglo-Catholic mystic and writer of the first part of the century, but she was at 46 by the time that she made that actual commitment to the church. She actually gave a series of lectures at Manchester College in Oxford, and also became a fellow at King's College, London, in 1927. Now, to be essentially home educated, to have done the work that she did, and be female, to be given these honours at this period of time, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, is quite a statement as to the work that she did and the knowledge that she had and the faith that she had, certainly in later life. As I said, a prominent Anglo-Catholic mystic of the 20th century. I want to talk about the coupling of opposites, and I'm using here the Taoist symbol, Taoist philosophical symbol of the yin and the yang, because how do we know one without knowing another? How do we know night or day without understanding each of them? Summer and winter, love and hate, companionship and loneliness, presence and absence, and divine union and spiritual isolation. I argue, and I think this is the basis of Taoist philosophy, if you want to understand the whole, you need to understand the constituent parts. And if you want to understand the other constituent part, you need to understand its opposite. And I think this is really quite important when we consider, Maria made a fantastic presentation on the mystics. And this is where I'm going to in this presentation, about having this divine sense of divine presence to then suddenly losing it. What effect does that have? What is the key learning from it? And how do we develop from this? And I've tried to put this as much as possible in a contemporary setting. And that's the basis I'm going to be asking some questions of us all a little bit later on. One of the sections in this, and I'm just going to ask the question up front, but you'll see it at the end, is I'm going to talk about awakening. When do we start to feel there's something else? This aspect of dualism, this aspect of two realities or more realities beyond the world that we see. Aspects of the belief in God, it's typically done on a philosophical basis. Evelyn was extraordinarily drawn to the writings of Plotinus, who an early Christian philosopher, spiritual philosopher, whose own founding was in Greek philosophy, Platonism, etc. Something greater, This aspect about when we're out in nature, what do we feel and see and sense other than the trees and the beauty of nature around us? I find it particularly striking. For instance, on a clear night sky, I have a love for astronomy. I'm fortunate to live in Scotland, so we have some fantastically clear, deep skies. And I often say to people, if you want to look into the face of God, go outside into the countryside on a clear night sky and just look into the sky. Art. It's beautiful art. These aspects of the way in which we see and sense things around us that takes beyond, a little bit beyond ourselves, and we start asking the questions to the what and the why. Architecture, people. In religious service and sacraments, one of the places I particularly am drawn to and have a great deal of love is, well, two actually. One is a little Anglican church chapel outside the boarding school used to be called Charlton Chapel on the northeastern side of Bath, where we had a lovely old Father Brown, who used to do all the services in Latin a long time ago, and the other place being York Minster. So where did our awakenings come from? Prayer and meditation being another route of seeing and something greater than and beyond ourselves. So over a period of time, for me, I became aware of a deeper sense of reality, sensing and being different to those people around me. That was hard. I felt like I was out of step with people around me, especially with some of the experiences I was having. Sensing others around me, having a companion from a young age. Sense most during emotional and periods of distress or danger. In my foolish youth, I used to do an awful lot of climbing, rock climbing and ice climbing. I remember one particular occasion when I fell off leading a gully climb in the Cairn Dorms, about 100 feet free fall, before my climbing partner managed to arrest me on a snow belay, of being very much aware of the presence beside me saying, "Andrew, relax, you're going to be okay." Through music, through places of worship, I think York Minster early in the morning, when there's hardly anybody there, or at night when you go in to attend evensong. It's a beautiful place, and one of the most beautiful services I attended recently with my wife was, I think it's called the service to St. Lucia. It's the first weekend in December. It's where, because of the Scandinavian York connection, they have the Swedish choir come over from Sweden. The nave is only lit by candlelight, and they do a carol service in Swedish by candlelight. Absolutely beautiful. I also attended a Franciscan retreat from school, out from Kingswood School for a day, and I found that extraordinarily moving, and one that almost caused me to consider really joining the Franciscans, but that was another battle that took place within me. So the question is, how did your awakening come about? Can you remember? Can you remember what it was like and what took place? Now I want to move on to illumination and ecstasy, this aspect of being in union. I think one of the most striking stories on a contemporary basis first is from Evelyn Underhill's poetry. In her poem Uxbridge Road, she describes the experience of illumination whilst walking along Uxbridge Road in London. And I've taken two parts of the verses here. I'll just read them out. To smear the little space between the city and the Somme, the torments of that seething tide, who is there that we can see. There is one who walks with starry feet the western road. By me, he is the drover of my soul. He leads the flock of men, all wistful on that weary track, and brings them back again. And I said, you can see this is Uxbridge Road. It's a poetry that's published by Evelyn Underhill. The second one is this famous story of Thomas Merton and his experience in Louisville on the 18th of March in 1958. I'll just read out this revelation that he had. This is the one, what's the word I'm looking for? Memorial, for want of a better phrase, to a mystical experience that exists in the United States. And the notice says, Merton had a sudden insight at the corner, this corner, on March the 18th, 1958, that led him to redefine his monastic identity and greater involvement with the social justice issue. He was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that all I loved, all these people, he found them walking around, shining like the sun. It may have had such an effect on him that it actually caused him to question the whole concept of living a separate holy existence in a monastery. He experienced the glorious destiny that comes from simply being a human being and being united with, not separate from, the rest of the human race. If there's one common element that I've heard through what Sammy said and what Maria said, it's this aspect of we are all one. We all eat from the same bread. And that's a fundamental, for me, that's a fundamental sense of just a basic spiritual truth that we are all one. Some common elements of the mystical experience, and I've taken this from a piece of work actually published by a previous member of the fellowship, Dr. Robert Crookall, who actually wrote a book called The Interpretation of Mystical and Cosmic Experiences, an expansion of consciousness, heightened destiny, sensitivity, of some or all senses, becoming fully awake, a growing sense of connection with part or everything around the recipient, at oneness, the sense of being with people. Thomas Merton actually relates to that in his experience in Louisville. It can happen in nature, it can happen basically anywhere. A perception of time, time stops. The perception of time stops with the intensity of the experience. A lucidity of immediate past and future, a sense of divine union, presence, some sense in the presence of God, a sense of love and joy never experienced before. Recipients struggle to describe the experience. I think one of the most impactful aspects of this that I understand is that of the famous theologian and Christian philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, who had his experience whilst participating in a mass for St. Nicholas in 1273. And it had such a dramatic impact on him that he basically said, I can write no more. I have seen the things that make my writing like straw. He didn't write anything for 4 to 5 years after that, and died shortly thereafter. Such was the impact of what had taken place. So what happens afterwards? This catalyst for change, the aftermath. I have been searching high and low to find where this is actually quoted from. I've heard it 2 or 3 times and it just sits in my mind, and it comes from America. When you've experienced the beauty and freedom of the prairie, how can you live in the barn? Yeah, live in the barn we must for our natural lives. There is a huge similarity between mystical experience and near-death experience. Near-death experience, for those of you who have read and heard about them, people who go through a medical emergency and suddenly find themselves elsewhere, find themselves having deeply religious spiritual events that can actually lead them to having such an event that they do not want to come back to normal life, but basically by the divine presence that's with them said, your time's not up yet, you need to go back. I'm a member of an NDE group, the UK NDE group, and interestingly, next Sunday on the 13th of March, we're having a conference on this, which is about the negative side, where it can lead to depression, where it can lead to really very, very dark thoughts, because I haven't been shown the beauty and ecstasy of something that's so real and so special to you, you suddenly lose it. This sense of loss, this drive to get back to the experience of illumination and union. You will read the stories of people who've had these experiences. I'm just focusing on NDEs for a minute. That's been so powerful. They would leave their family and their loved ones behind just to stay where they are. Triggers a review of life. potential onset of major change and outlook in what they are doing and the way they're going. Aspects about priorities, values, relationships, and can lead, and often does, to a dark night of the soul experience. So here we are. I've been building to this, been talking about one side of the coin, now going to the other side of the coin. The dark night of the soul, isolation. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day that you do not answer, and by night find no rest. Psalm 22, the first 2 verses. And further on, you forgive me because I'm with the screen, I can't read completely the text here, but I will get there with my notes. You just wait a minute. I know I page my notes, I did. Just as we heard Maria talking about John of the Cross, that which anguish soul feels most deeply is the conviction that God has abandoned it, for which it has no doubt that it is cast into the darkness as an abominable thing, this deep impact of isolation. Now, I've talked about this on coming so far on the backdrop of a deep mystical experience where you suddenly lose it. It's like going to the most fantastic party. You really want to be in the party, and you're standing outside in the dark. Somebody opens the door, says hello, shows you the party, and says you can't come in, closes the door, and you're left. And in simplistic terms, and I say it that way because many of the events in life can trigger these. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now, which is every human life is made up of light and dark, happy and sad, the vital and the deadening. How do you think about this rhythm and what makes all the difference? Our relationship, faith with God through this cycle. Are you going to hide out of self-delusion, becoming cynical and depressed? Or are you going to open your heart to the mystery that's as natural as the sun and the moon, the day and the night and the summer? How does our relationship with God change? And I'm just going to explore this a little bit further, taking some examples and also talk a little bit through personal experience. This is, I've got the books we can talk a little bit more about. Dark Nights of the Soul is a very good book by Thomas More. Evelyn Underhill, she interesting, again, we found out more about this after she had actually passed. She used to have these periods of what she called spiritual dryness, which she called the night shift, and they happened on a regular basis. Von Hugel, who was a spiritual director at the time, gave her the guidance. And he made this lovely comparison to a sailing ship, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. He said, captain of a sailing ship, be captain of your soul. Focus on the activities of life, not religious practice. That's what he actually said to him. Pardon me. Wait until the period passes. Let whatever transformation is taking place to take place. Sometimes consciously known, sometimes the change is not known, but basically just let it take place. He made this comparison with a sailing ship, but because he was talking about the late 1800s. And he said to Evelyn, when a sailing ship sails into the doldrums and there's no wind, what do the crew do? They focus on other things. And that was basically what he was telling me. In fact, he actually gave us saying, cut back on your religious practice as much as possible. If it's a few prayers in the morning or the evening and communion at the weekends, that's all you need to do. Focus on the other things in your life. So it's an act of faith in the process. One of the striking stories is that of Teresa of Calcutta. And again, when she passed and her papers, which she asked to be destroyed, but the Vatican refused because she was such an important person to the Christian faith, the contemporary Christian faith in the Catholic Church. They said no. And in going through her papers, they found that her dark night of the soul lasted for over 50 years. She'd made a vow to dedicate herself to Christ in the younger years, and she was basically felt that she was held to account for that vow for a majority of her life. And here are some of the correspondence that came out from her. And she says, in my soul, I feel this just terrible pain and loss of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing. She goes on, and this is later on, as she started to learn to cope with what's taken place, I have begun to love my darkness, for I believe now that it is in part, a very small part of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth. And she goes on, I want to satiate your thirst with every single drop of blood that you can find to me. Please do not take the trouble to return soon. I am ready to wait for you for all eternity. The strength of what's taking place. Maria talked to this transformation that's taking place during these darkest of episodes, but not completely, although it looks this way with Teresa, not completely losing faith with what is taking place. The other striking one is Oscar Wilde, and you may raise your eyebrows at this one. He was jailed in 1918, pardon me, 1895, I believe, yes, for basically homosexual acts, which were illegal at that time. It broke him because he had what they called hard labor and hard bed, where basically you just put in the treadmill, breaking stones, and basically just had a wooden bed to sleep on. He died in 1900, 2 years after his release. But he said this, to me, suffering is a sacramental thing, and it makes those whom it touches holy. And he talks further in his writings about how it takes the encrustation off the soul, and that encrustation is due to materialism, this materialistic part of life. I've had 3 distinct episodes of deep spiritual isolation. The first was coming to terms with myself as a young man. As I explained further, I felt like I walked out of step with so many people around me, almost everybody. The best way I can describe it is I felt like a leaf in the wind, and it didn't matter what I tried to do, whichever urge or emotion got hold of me, I was taken in that direction, and it was not a pleasant experience. And it lasted 5-6 years until I really came to terms with myself. I had a major episode with my ongoing awakening where certain realities were really starting to become embedded in me, and I felt actually abandoned at that point in time. The third was last year, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this during 2021, of dealing with the loss of my mother and my brother literally within a number of weeks of each other. During the second episode of my own spiritual isolation, out of nowhere, this prayer came into my head, and it's one that I've held to me. It's a simple prayer, but it's one that's quite special to me. May heaven's doors open above me and hell's fires below. As God is my witness, I will not fail. Dear Lord, do not desert me now. And there's been times when I've held on to that because it's actually helped me as I needed to in going forward. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened to me and make some comparisons with a beautiful book, which I read earlier this year, is Grief. I'm sure all of you in your lives have had to come to terms with this, of losing loved ones. Sometimes they're expected, sometimes they're not. My mother was 98 on the 22nd of March last year. On the 24th of March last year, sitting on her bed with a GP at her side, basically she took the decision that she was going to die at home and die in bed, and she had a Victorian death. I nursed her with her carer for the last month of her life, giving her morphine 4 times a day. I was with her when she passed. Some beautiful experiences to make this all happening. And with her carer, Sean, because of COVID and because of all the restrictions, actually had to lay her body out before the funeral directors came to take her away. That was bad enough. Then at my mother's funeral, a few weeks later, my brother, my next brother, Nick, who was not at all well, was really quite sick and poorly. He'd only just got over leukemia the year before, went to see his consultant specialist. They did a whole series of biopsies and basically found out he had a very nasty aggressive cancer. He died 3.5 weeks later. So in the space of 2 to 3 months, I had to deal one expected loss, which was bad enough, but then it's deal with the loss of my brother in a number of weeks of each other. And in just reflecting on these, on what I learned and what I went through, and just to tell you, share with you about how tough it was for me at that point. In September, having dealt with my mother and my brother's passing, I was not sleeping too well, so I was in a spare room here at home. I'm blessed with a rock in my life, my wife Margaret, bless her. And I remember lying in bed, feeling physically, emotionally, and spiritually exhausted. And I actually cried out. I said, am I going to know no more joy or happiness in my life, but just exist for the remainder of my life? Things happened, I got a tap on the shoulder, things moved on. And I think it's probably fair to say that you don't get over grief. It settles and you just learn to live with aspects of it, which is probably the best way I can describe it. Anyway, I want to turn to the writings of C.S. Lewis, and it's a very emotional book, very grounded book, I'd argue very beautiful book, A Grief Observed by Lewis. And he's writing about the time after the death of his wife, Joy Gresham, who he referred to as H, Helen being a Christian name. And he had 4 exercise books, blank books from the college he was teaching at, and he used them. And he vowed he would basically fill these books with the statements and thoughts and reflections that he had, dealing with what was taking place, and no more than the 4 books. And A Grief Observed is basically those 4 books published in 1961 after the death of Joy in 1960. Cancer, cancer, and cancer. My mother, my father, my wife. I wonder who is next in the queue. I knock on the door. He does not answer. Then, interesting enough, he writes one night about feeling the presence of Helen with him, of Joy with him. He questions it the following day. He is starting to settle and starting to come to terms a little bit with what is actually happening. And he writes, at the height of his anger, is it rational to believe in a bad God? Anyway, in a God so bad as all that, a cosmic sadist, a spiteful imbecile, reflecting the depth of anger at God, anger at the lack of God in his life, that point of view, what's taking time. And then later, as he settles, he makes this most beautiful statement. When I lay these questions before God, I get no answer, but a special sort of no answer. It is not a locked door. It's more like a silent, not uncompassionate gaze. It's as though he shook his head, not in waving the question aside. Peace, child, you do not understand. And I think that is sometimes when we find ourselves in these darkest of places, we'll get to this. He's there. He's always with us. I'm drawn to the final verse of Matthew 28:20. I'm with you for all time. So the most crucial aspects of this is precisely the temptation to doubt God himself. We must not minimize the danger of this. For here we are advancing beyond the stage of God who has made himself in our mind as simple and primitive. We are entering the night which he is present without any image, inscrutable, beyond satisfactory mental representation. And this comes from Thomas Merton, who we talked about earlier in Louisville on contemplative prayer, about just saying the part of the process, in their view, of Dark Soul Night is our progression development, where it actually is a process of transformation and change that's taking place within us. So it's an experience of growth and change of our spiritual being through a period of isolation, trial, and testing. This change is taking place at the very deepest levels of our existence. Through this experience, we can gain a purer, closer, deeper relationship with God. Thomas Merton states, for it is in this testing, this fire of purgation that burns, out the accidental elements of our faith in order to liberate the deep spiritual power at the center of our beings. What dark nights of the soul experiences have you had from that? Have you noticed any change within yourself or your relationship with God because of them? So, traveling through the dark night, beautiful photograph of the Eagle Nebula there on the left. Taking care of ourselves. This is some of the now bringing together elements from von Hugel and also Thomas More. Giving ourselves what we need at the deepest level. Let the process work its way through us. Focus on everyday life. Hobbies, pastimes, and activities. Talk to trusted friends and express what your thoughts and feelings are. And I think this is so fundamentally important. I retired a little over 4 years ago now. Within 2 weeks, it's been something I've been wanting to do for a while. I went along to an open evening with our local Samaritans branch. And within 6 months, having gone through all of their various examinations and training and so on, I have been for the last 4 years, a listening Samaritan. When people are in the darkest of places, the most troubled of times, just having the ability to speak to somebody and explore their short thoughts and feelings, it is just the essence of just sharing that is a form of release and can help the person concerned. You don't give necessary advice, you don't make any judgments, you just let them speak and give them support as they go through the process. The same is for us when we're going through these dark periods. Trust that we'll know when we've traveled the path. And again, this is from Dark Nights of the Soul. It's the publication by Thomas More. So, question to you. How have you coped with your own dark night or night shift episodes? Have you fought them or you've let them be? It's very easy to talk about them when you're through them, but when in the heart of it, it can be increasingly difficult. So, just to sort of change it and enlighten it a little bit, I've made an analogy here with forced rhubarb. It's a sort of food that you love or hate. It's like Marmite, which is that yeast extract. It's grown naturally in the UK from late spring through the summer. I love it. As I said, I have it in the morning. We've got about 6 or 7 varieties of rhubarb in our garden, and I like it stewed with Greek yogurt in the morning. It's also grown by forcing from January onwards. And it's grown predominantly in the Yorkshire rhubarb triangle, which I didn't know is actually a protected area from the food supply area. It has a special status. It's the area between Leeds, Bradford, and oh heavens, I forget, Wakefield. It's grown in total darkness, seeking light, producing strong, vibrant plants that consider a delicacy. The photograph I've got here, I started this presentation with a candle. In a sense, I'm finishing it with a candle. They use candles when they actually go in to pick the crops, but most of the time it's just grown in total darkness. To gain strength and form in total darkness, searching for light. There's something quite allegorical about that statement, especially when we're in the darkest of places. So, just some closing thoughts. I'm returning back to Evelyn. I found this at the back of a book called Radiance, a spiritual memoir of Evelyn Underhill. And for me, this summarizes so many of, for me, my own spiritual truths and what I truly believe in. Here we are, little half animal, half spiritual creatures, mysteriously urged from within and enticed from without to communion with spiritual reality. If and when we surrender to this craving and this attraction, we enter thereby to first dimly a completely new life, full of variety of new joy. So with that, the final 15 minutes, I just think I'd like to leave it open to questions.
Andrew, many thanks. Very much enjoyed your talk there. Very moving, and again, a lot of food for thought. I love your analogy of the rhubarb triangle. Growing up on the edge of that, it was a big part of my childhood. So I love that what you've drawn out there. I think there's a lot to take from that. A great allegory. I've had no questions come through as yet. So if anybody has anything that they would like to share, please do let us know. You don't need to necessarily type it in. If you've got a question, please just unmute yourself and ask.
I see we've got a question from Ellen.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, yeah, that's just come through on my screen now.
Yeah, sorry.
So yes, yeah, that's fine. So Ellen asks, what has changed within you as a result of your experiences?
I would say two things. I have it's hard to describe, a deeper relationship with God than I've ever had before. And actually, the other thing has been quite surprising. I was reflecting on this morning. I found a source of strength in me that I never realized I ever had. And it's a very positive form as well. There are times now I feel where I can almost face anything. I'm not sure I want to put that to the test, but that is that sense that's come from the back of it. It's a very quiet strength. Yes.
I think for a question from myself, really, when things were really dark, what stopped you from giving up? What kept you going? What hope or light did you see that meant that you kept taking the next step?
In truth, I never lost faith. I mean, it may have got battered, it may have been reduced to an absolute limited element. It's kind of like when I was dealing with my mother last year. I remember doing what I had to do and saying to myself, what I have to do now, and I will pay the emotional price for this later. Actually, at the time of both my mother and my brother's death, I prayed like mad to God to take them because I could see the suffering that was taking place in front of my eyes. And I actually prayed for the death. And that came from a deep sense of love and compassion for both of them. And actually, my trust in God. That's probably the only way I can describe it, actually. So yes, I mean, it's on the back of that I've developed this deeper, stronger relationship in myself. And it's very hard to describe that. And the words really don't do this proper justice. But just know that He's there.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they would like to ask Andrew? I would just like to say, Andrew, it was nothing personal to put you on what you term the graveyard shift. It was quite an arbitrary decision as to when. It says nothing about what we think of you at all.
That's all right.
Oh, bless you. Thank you. And if we've got no further questions, then I think, oh, sorry, we have another question. Do you see God in your work with the Samaritans? For those of you that don't know Andrew, he does volunteer for the Samaritans. Often you've left early, haven't you, from the WhatsApp chat to go and do your work there. So have you seen God in that work you do?
Yes, and it's quite frequently when I'm on what I'll call the most serious calls, there are three things happening at the same time. One, as I'm on the call speaking to the person who's going through the darkest of times. Two, I'm typically looking at the internet, believe it or not, because of what they're showing, just to try and understand what's taking place from my own perspective. And three, I also pray for them, and those prayers that I give at times like that are extraordinarily short and to the point. And I see my Samaritans work as part of one of the things I wanted to do when I retired is to be of service to others, and that's what I see taking place, and I feel that I am fulfilling that aspect, that service to each other and service to God through doing that. So your short answer to your question, Ellen, is yes, I do.
Wonderful. Now, you mentioned earlier on the group that you are part of that looks at NDEs and the forthcoming conference there. There's a couple of queries about that that have been asked. Is that conference open to anyone, or is it just for members of the organisation?
It's open to anybody and everyone, and if there are people on this today who would like to attend, what I'll do, Joe, is I will send you the link to getting through. I think they just ask for a small fee to pay the cost of it, and the actual talk is from, I think it's 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock next Sunday evening. Then there's like a community discussion, etc. afterwards. And actually, a lady who has presented to the fellowship is actually part of it. That's Dr. Penny Satori, who has done a lot of work and published books and so on as well. So yes.
Yeah, yes, Penny is a member of the fellowship. So yeah, it's good that she's been able to speak there. So thank you. Yes, if you could send the details through, that'd be really gratefully received.
Yeah.
Another one last question at the moment then. Do you think that the dark night can be something that's not just individual, it's exhibited in communities or towns or countries? And if so, what do you think the church could offer in particular to journey through it?
Yeah. Okay, well, being extraordinarily topical for a minute, I think the answer to that is yes. And I would suggest that collectively there's a very large group of us, if not all of us, who are entering something like, at least say, like a twilight part of the dark solar night. We're given the conflict that's taking place within the Ukraine right now. All of us will probably remember the Cold War. All of us can remember some aspects of that, the fear what went through at that point in time. And I don't know about you, but living in the community here, I can feel and sense that tension and unease amongst people that I know in the little village here, where people are saying, where is this going to end and what's taking place? And I think, yes, there is. And I think the church could offer and does offer help. And I think Maria worded some aspects around dealing with grief particularly well, about how we actually can achieve that on a more broad basis. I don't know, but I'm convinced that the church certainly is a vehicle. You look at what the church did during the, it's not a very nice comparison, I'm going there anyway. Look at what the church did during the Second World War and the sort of services they had for giving people support, etc. That period of time of great uncertainty. The answer is yes.
Yes. I think perhaps even on from that as well is what could we do as a fellowship to speaking to that as well. It might be worth something that would be worth investigating. Obviously, we were formed as an organisation just following the Second World War, when people were asking all those questions about where are our loved ones, why is this happening? And I think the more we journey together as a fellowship, I think the more we're getting to be able to speak into these questions. So if any of you are interested in finding out more about how you could perhaps help with that kind of thing, if you've got articles you could write for our journals or our website, do get in touch with us, because we're always interested in hearing from people. And I know I speak for Ellen and Matt as editors of our two journals, Fellowship Review and the Christian Parapsychologist. We are always on the lookout for new writings of any sort, academic, theological, personal experience. So please do, if you have anything to offer, do get in touch with us. We have another question that's come in there. So you've spoken really eloquently about the importance of prayer in the midst of a dark night. Did your relationship with God within your prayer life evolve during those dark nights?
It feels like it did. And this is what I mean about the difficulty of sometimes describing aspects about the feelings and thoughts and so on around this. Yes, it did. That's the reason why I was drawn to what Lewis wrote when he basically had the closing statement, "Peace, child, you don't understand." He's like the silent companion, you feel and sense the support, but you don't necessarily feel and sense the presence in the way you may do at other times. And as I think it was going through that process, I think describe it with the deepening of the relationship with God that I had took place, has taken place. Yes. I've been given quite a few prayers actually during periods like this, but that one that I've shared with you is the, for me, the most potent actually that was happened, and that was 15, 16 years ago. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, thank you so much. It's been a joy to have you with us and to wrestle through these things with us. Really appreciate you taking the time out. I know you're very busy with your studies at the moment, so thank you so much for coming and speaking to us.